صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا رسول الله. صلى الله عليك وعلى آل بيتك المعصومين المظلومين. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله يا غريب يا مظلوم كربلاء يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة. ما خاب والله من تمسك بكم وأمن من لجأ إليكم. فيا ليتنا كنا معكم فنفوز فوزا عظيما. غريب كربلاء. All together. Let the Imam hear you. غريب كربلاء, estranged on the land of Karbala. مظلوم كربلاء, Karbala, estranged on the land of Karbala, oppressed on the land of Karbala. Mazlum Karbala, oppressed on the land of Karbala. Shaheed Karbala, martyred on the land of Karbala. Shaheed Karbala, martyred on the land of Karbala. Assalamu al-Hussein. All together, let's send our salams and visit the Imam al-Hussein. Salamullahi alayhi. Let the Imam hear you as you send your salutations to him. Assalamu ala al-Hussein wa ala Ali ibn al-Hussein wa ala awlad al-Hussein wa ala ashab al-Hussein wa ala alladhina badhalu ajrahum دون الحسين ورحمة الله وبركاته. صلوات. اللهم صل على محمد. قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in the Holy Quran, and what he says is the truth. In the chapter of Al-Hujurat, chapter 49, verse 6, Allah says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِنْ جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا أَن تُصِيبُوا قَوْمًا بِجَهَالَةٍ فَتُصْبِحُوا عَلَى مَا فَعَلْتُمْ نَادِمِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in this holy verse, he says, O you who believe, if someone who is corrupt comes to you with news, then you should investigate. For if you don't, you may cause people to fall into wrongdoing, to fall into following the wrong information. And then what will happen is you will become guilty for what you did. You will feel a sense of regret and guilt. صدق الله العلي العظيم. آمنا بالله. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today our goal is to speak about the issue of trustworthiness. Now, trustworthiness is something that's important to our daily lives. It's something that has to do with the actual fabric of society. the fabric of society is healthy by how much trust there is in it. Trustworthiness implies that people are truthful with one another, truthful in their transactions, and truthful in their words. Truthfulness in their words implies that they have sincerity in their intentions. If they have sincerity in their intentions, then that means that it is reflected in their actions. And so what ends up happening is people look at others optimistically. And therefore they're able to understand that this life, true one, that can be happy and can be joyful. Why? Because it is full of trust. However, when people are insincere with one another, when they are dishonest with one another, when they don't contribute to each other's lives positively, what ends up happening is a lack of trust between mankind. And when there is a lack of trust, what results is cynicism. And with cynicism comes a sense of doubt. I doubt that my friend will actually keep his word when he makes me a promise. I doubt that my parents will give me the car that they promised me when I turn 16. I doubt that my teacher will increase my grade if I do well on the extra credit assignments that she assigned to me. You see, without trust and without trustworthiness, society can become extremely ill, dysfunctional. As a simple example, if we look at a family that is considered to be a broken family, a family that has, a parent and a mother that are dysfunctional, what ends up happening is that the kids end up having a lack of trust in relationships as they grow up. So essentially then, trust and trustworthiness is extremely essential to our lives. Now we need to take a look at the issue of trustworthiness from several standpoints or perspectives. The first is one that is purely logical, right? And the second is an academic one. And the last perspective that we'll look at is the Islamic perspective. So logically speaking then, based on our introduction, we were able to understand then that in order for society to function properly, it has to be built on trust and trustworthiness. So trust is different than trustworthiness, right? So I am the person who trusts, and I can either be trustworthy or someone else will be trustworthy. Now, I trust someone, and when I trust someone, I place my faith in them. If I trust them with a secret, then I trust the fact that they will not divulge it to anybody else, right? If I trust a person with money, right, then I have entrusted them, and I expect them not to use that money. I expect them, meaning that I have an expectation, right, of them to fulfill an agreement that we have with one another. Now, of course, that does put me in a vulnerable state, right? However, that is what it involves. It involves me letting down my guard. Now, this is a risk, of course. And this risk is truly a mitigated risk, meaning that I have to assess whether this person is trustworthy enough for me to place my trust in them. How so? Now, this might seem obvious to many of us, right? But I want to kind of analyze it and logically see where this trust is rooted, how it is that I trust people, just from a logical and rational standpoint. Now, I know, for example, that if I trust someone, I trust them because of several reasons. One, either because they're extremely knowledgeable, or two, they've contributed something to me that is positive, right? And that contribution has caused me to gain trust in them. They have sacrificed something for me, and the result of their sacrifice is a form of contribution, right? Their sacrifice is a form of contribution. And because of that sacrifice, then I will give them my trust. Now, of course, the level of sacrifice determines the level of trust. And vice versa. So if a person, doesn't sacrifice anything at all, then there's no point in me trusting them, right? Also, a person's reputation. So if a person is reputable for being trustworthy, being a good person, being a sincere person, then what ends up happening is people end up trusting them. So that means then, in order for someone to be trustworthy, they have to have certain attributes. And I've already determined that these attributes are essential ones, meaning that they have to be part and parcel in that person's character and that person's personality. So, for example, if someone always jokes around, I'm less likely to take them seriously, which means that I'm less likely to take them seriously with things that are important. And therefore, I'm less likely to trust them. Now, I may trust them, but not as much as someone who's always serious, who's sincere. Does that mean that I always have to be serious, Sheikh? No, it doesn't. It just means that I can't always be the type of person that takes things lightly and belittles things. Because if I do, then people will think that I will belittle their trust, and that would deem me untrustworthy. See? So that means then that sincerity is at the root of trustworthiness. Right? Truthfulness is at the root of trustworthiness. Contribution to society is at the root of trustworthiness. Sacrifice is at the root of a person's character, a person who would be deemed to be trustworthy. And leadership. A person who is considered to be a leader normally is trusted. Why? Because I trust him with the decisions that he will make for me. I know also that my Creator, He gave me leaders in my life who are guides. These guides have been entrusted by Allah Almighty to take care of me and my siblings. And therefore, He has deemed me or my parents trustworthy of taking care of me and my siblings. So that means that this trustworthiness can be given to a person if they are a person that is deemed worthy of trust. So if somebody who is at a higher level shows trust in a person, right, so then a leader is trusted. But if a leader shows confidence in another person, then that confidence translates into trustworthiness as well. So rationally speaking then, we come to understand that there are many factors that allow a person to look at another as being trustworthy. And by considering these specific characteristics that this person may have, then that means then that will allow me and others to trust that person, to trust them with information that they disseminate, with data, to trust them with wealth, to trust them with my life, right? I know also that a person has to be knowledgeable in order for me to trust them. If a person is not knowledgeable in a specific issue, then I'm not going to trust them. If I want to consult someone, I consult them if it is part of their area of expertise. So if I want to make an investment, then I go to a person who is an investment planner, a person who is well known to be an investor and a successful one at that. If I want to do well on my physics exam, then I'm going to find a tutor that has achieved high grades and perhaps has studied under the same teacher or taken the same course that I've taken and have aced it. And that deems them trustworthy because they're more knowledgeable. Now, a person that is trustworthy in one part of their life might not necessarily be trustworthy in another part of their life. Let me give you an example. A person who may be great in physics, right, can be trusted with the knowledge that they have and with teaching others. However, when it comes to that person, for, as an example, drinking alcohol, right, because we have people in universities who are professors in physics, as an example, or biology or chemistry, but they drink alcohol, and that makes them untrustworthy when it comes to the issue of taking care of themselves or driving themselves home, for example, at night. And we see in many cases on TV where there are people who are scholarly but are caught with DUIs, right? We see it on the news all the time. And this, though, is less likely to happen amongst those who are knowledgeable and those who are considered to be guides within society, or those who are considered to be more responsible in society. And therefore, also responsibility becomes part of trustworthiness. Now, what characteristics does that person who is trustworthy, right, have to have within themselves as well? They have to have a sense of shame. Let me explain to you why. Because if I feel a sense of shame, then I'm less likely to set my responsibilities aside. If I have a sense of shame, then I'm less likely to want to put myself in a state where I may be embarrassed or humiliated for doing something wrong. And so that sense of responsibility, right, to fulfill the trust that someone has placed within me is well rooted in my own sense of shame, that I am afraid of bad consequences happening if I don't fulfill the promise that I made, or if I don't fulfill the agreement that was made between me and someone else. So that's the logical perspective then. What do the academics tell us? Now, there are several studies that were done on trustworthiness. And I found some interesting ones that are worthy of mentioning. One was done by Emma Levine et al. Emma Levine and her students, or her team, her colleagues as well, conducted a study on trustworthiness. Now, we explained that there's a difference between trust and trustworthiness. And in modern psychology, they have also determined the difference between the two. It's very similar to how I described it. That if someone is trustworthy, then that means that that people will place their trust in them. Okay. Now the question, and of course, someone who has trust is someone who's placed themselves in a place of vulnerability, right, where they have entrusted something with someone. Okay. So this is how they differentiate between trust and trustworthiness. Now, trust is spoken about in several studies. I'm going to speak about trust as it pertains to data. I'm going to speak about trust as it pertains to individuals, to people. And this is the study that I will cite, that I cited a second ago, regarding the studies that were done by Emma Levine, and a professor out of the University of Chicago. And also Taya Cohen, who is also a professor in Carnegie Mellon University. She's an associate professor, I should say, in psychology as well. Now, when it comes to data, data is determined to be trustworthy if it has 5 key components. The first is credibility. The second is transferability. The third is dependability. The fourth is confirmability. And the fifth is authenticity. Now you can imagine that these very characteristics, when it comes to data, can also be applicable to a person. If a person is credible, if a person is transferable, meaning that I can take this, just as I will trust this information from this source, then I can also continue to trust it if it comes from the same source. So that person's trustability becomes transferable to others as well, okay, if I apply it to a human being. Though this is only really a determination on data itself, but I thought it worthy of mentioning it, that it can be applied to a person's character as well. As well, dependability, that if a person is a responsible individual, right? Just like if the data is responsible data, I can depend on. As well, we said confirmability, meaning that I can research and confirm that this information indeed is correct, right? After investigation. And also authenticity. It has to be authentic information. either I can authenticate this information myself, right? Or depend on a source to authenticate it for me. But in all intents and purposes, it has to be authenticated, right? So this is data. That's number one. The second thing I want to cover in the academic perspective is Emma Levine's studies. And this is a new study that was out of the University of Chicago. And what she determined, and this is mentioned in the Journal of Psychology and or the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, I should say. Now, what she concluded, her and her team, is that a person who is trustworthy is a person who has something called guilt proneness, meaning that that person is prone to feeling guilty. So she determined that this is the strongest predictor of trustworthiness. In association, or I should say, when we associate guilt proneness with trustworthiness, what ends up happening is the person is deemed to be responsible. So the root then of, I should say, trustworthiness is an innate sense of responsibility. This guilt proneness, what is it? It's the expectation, she says, of experiencing guilt in the future, and therefore it becomes associated with the avoidance of wrongdoing in the first place. So the more the person has guilt proneness, is prone to being guilty if they get it wrong, if they fail on the responsibility, right? The more likely they are to hate the negative consequences by not fulfilling that responsibility. And as a result, they become the type of person that can be trusted, and therefore they're deemed to be trustworthy. Now, another important thing to mention is a study done by Thea Cohen. Now, Thea Cohen is also a colleague of Emma Levine. Thea Cohen, we mentioned, is an associate professor of psychology in Carnegie Mellon University. And she says that the way to determine, because this is what the next thing that we'd probably ask, is how do we determine if a person is trustworthy or not? Right? We determine that, well, they have to be guilt prone. But how can we know if a person is guilt prone? So the study that she did determined that you can figure out whether a person is guilt prone or not by simply asking them how they dealt in their lives with specific calamitous situations or hardships that they went through. If, as you listen to them, you find that they have a deal of guilt and regret for not doing things a specific way, then that means that that person is guilt prone. And the higher the level of regret and guilt that that person expresses, the more trustworthy they are. Now, there was another study that was cited in Scientific American, and it was done by a group of scholars and researchers in China. And this study was specifically done on the trustworthiness that can be determined of a person from their face. And they conducted this study on kids. They determined that these 8 to 12-year-olds, amongst themselves, if a person was good-looking, then they were more likely to be trusted than someone who wasn't. The more liked they were, the more trustworthy innately they were determined to be by the other individual or the other child, which is quite interesting. So this is a look at the innate sensibility that we have in determining or choosing whether a person is trustworthy or not. And that is likability, right? So, and that likability, first and foremost, by just looking at a person's face, is more likely to be determined by their sense of confidence, by how they look, right? And if they are symmetrical in their look. If they are athletic, for example, handsome or pretty, then what ends up happening is we're most likely to want to have a greater proximity to them, and therefore have already trusted them with what? With our emotions and with our state of happiness, and with with the credibility that gives them at face value, right? At face value alone. Now we want to move on to the Islamic perspective. So we started out with a verse, a very important verse of chapter 49, Al-Hujurat, verse number 6, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to those who believe, and He says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, O you who believe, in ja'akum, if this specific type of person comes to you, fasiqun binaba'in. Fasiq is a person who is corrupt. Now we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also explained, and we mentioned this in a previous lecture, that a person can be mu'min and fall out of their state of iman, their state of faith, by an act of sarcasm, an act of humiliating someone else. And therefore they can become fasiq by doing so. A person can be mu'min, but if they lie, right, they can become fasiq. Right? If a person who, for example, is a mu'min or a believer can become fasiq by doing things that are sinful. And so then it becomes easy for me to determine in Islam that a person who is not fasiq then is a person most likely who is going to be trustworthy. Let's continue and see what this verse actually tells us. So we said, O you who believe, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, in ja'akum fasiqun, if a corrupt person comes to you, binaba'in, with news, fatabayyanu, then you should investigate the news. Figure out its, first of all, figure out its authenticity, right? That's what you need to do. Figure out whether the data is credible and whether the person it's coming from is credible, because that person's credibility, right, determines the level of trust I have in the data that they're going to give me. Notice how the modern research, right, is reflecting what this one verse that was revealed 1400 years ago is telling me, right? Credibility then of the deliverer of the information, of the data, is extremely important. It's so important that the very data, and it could be credible, and it could be authentic, but that very data becomes doubted if the person who delivers the data is not credible, is not authentic himself, right? Is not sincere, is not a contributor to society, that his sense of responsibility is not transferable. People just don't trust them. And therefore, when they bring you information, such as a liar who comes to you, someone who's known for lying, or someone who's known for joking all the time, or someone who's always sarcastic, right? Someone who's always sarcastic, you never know when they're telling the truth and when they're not, right? You don't know when they're sincere and when they're not, right? And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala later on in the chapter of Hujurat, He mentions that one should not be sarcastic, one should not make fun of others. Why? Because the line between truth and falsehood, right, reality and falsehood becomes blurry. And you're not going to know whether your relationship with other people is truly good or not. Right? Because it's all based on joking, and it's all based on a lack of sincerity towards one another. And of course we know, and in many cultures, and I won't point out any cultures specifically, but in many cultures we find that many people tend to be sarcastic towards their siblings, towards their friends, towards even their parents. Right? And parents tend to be sarcastic towards their kids. And this, what it does, is it literally shakes the very ground that the person is on. They always feel a sense of instability when they're around that person who is sarcastic towards them, who is making fun of them, who is humiliating them. How many times have we seen this happen? When a person comes into a mosque, right, a young man, and he has gel in his hair, right, and some people make comments about him and they say, How could you have that gel on your hair, walking into the mosque? Look at you, gel in his hair, walking into the mosque. As though putting gel in your hair is haram. Where does it say that putting gel in your hair is haram? Nowhere. I hate to break it to you. Right? The very fact that this person has come to the mosque, right, in itself is something that the person should be commended for, not persecuted for, not humiliated for, not dealt with as though he is fasiq or corrupt because he put a little bit of gel in his hair. Or a person comes with a cap on, right? You can't pray with a cap on. Where does it say that you should not pray with a cap on? The cap shouldn't prevent your forehead from touching the turba, right? When you're in a state of prostration. But covering one's head is actually mustahab in Islam. What else? There are many things. Me reminding my children of past faults. Oh, remember that one time when you did this? Or calling each other names, just as we said before in a past lecture. All of these things create a lack of trust and trustworthiness. And that lack of trust can occur between a father and a son and his child, right? And this in itself is extremely dangerous. Because what happens when that happens between a son and a child is the fact that that son will no longer trust the leadership and the guidance of that parent. This is essential for us to understand. Because if we understand it, then it's going to be a lot easier for us to be able to deal with our own children and to deal with our friends and our colleagues, whether it's at work or at school or in general. And therefore, the path to trustworthiness, right, is paved with sincerity. First and foremost. Sincerity has to be to Allah first and foremost. In the second hadith that is mentioned in the book of Al-Kafi, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends Jibreel alayhi salam to Adam, and he tells him that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has asked me to give you the option of choosing one of these three items that I have brought to you. Number one, he says al-aql, intellect. Number one, he says ad-din, religion. Number two, he says haya, he says a sense of shame. And number three, he says the intellect. Prophet Adam alayhi salam, he chooses the intellect. Jibreel then tells deen, religion, and shame, the sense of shame or shyness, and insarifa, return from whence you came. But they respond to him and they say to Jibreel, Inna Allah amarana an nakuna ma'al aql aynama kan aw aynama dar. We were commanded by Allah to be with aql, intellect, wherever it goes. And therefore that means that a person cannot be someone of high intellect unless they have a sense of shame or shyness. And they cannot be religious unless they have a sense of shame and shyness as well. Right. So, in Islam then, the formula is very simple. That in order for me to be trustworthy, I have to have worked very hard on my intellect. And we spoke about the importance of the intellect in past lectures. And I refer you to those lectures. Al-aql is defined as ma ubida bihi ar-Rahman واكتسب به الجنان, or ما عرف به الرحمن واكتسب به الجنان, according to Amir al-Mu'minin salamullah alayhi. Aql or intellect is that with which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is worshipped or known, and it is also that with which heaven is attained. And that can only occur with a sense of sincerity towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And remember, that is the root of Tawheed, as Amir al-Mu'minin salamullah alayhi told us in the very first sermon that is mentioned in Nahj al-Balagha, in the second paragraph, where he says, أول الدين معرفته. If I want to know how to have the best religion, right, to be really religious, then first and foremost he says, the first of religion is to know Allah. وكمال معرفته التصديق به, and the complete form and the perfection of knowing Him is to prove His existence, right? to qualify his existence, confirmability, to confirm his existence. Right? And then he says, وَكَمَالُ التَّصْدِيقِ بِهِ تَوْحِيدُ. He says, and the completion and the perfection of confirming his existence is to have tawheed. And the best form of tawheed, وَكَمَالُ تَوْحِيدِهِ الْإِخْلَاصُ لَهُ. The best form of ikhlas, of tawheed, afwan, is sincerity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if I'm sincere to Allah, then I'm going to be sincere to His creations. And if I'm sincere to His creations, then I'm going to contribute to society. I'm going to be kind. I'm going to be loving. I'm going to be tolerant. And I'm going to be patient. And I'm going to focus on gaining knowledge. And focus on showing gratitude to Allah through my actions. And if I do so, then what will happen is I will be the opposite of a person who is corrupt. And therefore, I will become someone who is trustworthy. The fuqaha, our jurists, they have extensively studied this verse in the principles of jurisprudence. That the mafhum of this verse, meaning the concept that is understood from this verse, verse 6 of Al-Hujurat, is the opposite of the mantuq. The mantuq is what is spoken. So what is spoken is if someone who is corrupt comes to you, O you who believe, with information, then authenticate it, investigate it, qualify it. Don't just take it, and certainly don't just send it right out in a WhatsApp message without reading it or checking what the source is. And if you don't know, just don't send it out. So trustworthiness then can only occur if a person has all of those important characteristics that we mentioned. And if they do, then and only then I can take what they say, right? Exactly like al-bayyinah. And al-bayyinah in Islam, in our fiqh, if I know, for example, that the crescent moon is about to show sometime today or tomorrow. We're at the end of the month, we don't know, 29th or 30th day. Okay? And a group of people, they go out to sight the crescent moon. And I know that two of them who came to me are trustworthy, right? Meaning that they are Shia, Ithna Ashari, they are just, right? Just meaning that they do the wajibat, they stay away from the muharramat, and they know how to crescent moon sight. That gives them credibility, right? And authenticity, right? But I still might ask them, how did you see it? What direction was it? How far was it from the moon? How high was it from the horizon? Right? This is what we do every month of Ramadan, and actually every month with those who sight the crescent moon. And so then we take what al-bayyinah gives us, the two just witnesses. Same thing in a court of law. Right? Why? Because they have all of these characteristics. And if they don't, then I don't have to take what they say. I don't. Trustworthiness then is essential in Islam, and it's determined by the fact that a person has to have the quintessential characteristic of sincerity to Allah, and therefore sincerity to humanity and to everything else. And if that happens, then when I come as a trustworthy person and deliver a piece of information, right, I'm going to expect others to believe me because I've earned that trust. I have a sense of responsibility. I feel ashamed, right? And I feel a sense of guilt if I deliver the wrong information. This is essential. That sense of responsibility, that sense of understanding that to every action that I do, there is a consequence. Islam focuses on this issue and rewards those who have that sensibility. So we find then that Islam 1400 years ago actually tells us really clearly through one verse. And if we look at the chapter of Hujurat, right, it really focuses on many important concepts. This is only one of them. In order for a society to be harmonious, right, this is an important part of that harmony. It's an important part of that puzzle. And there was no one who is more trustworthy with the message than the Imams themselves, right? Allah placed His trust in the Prophet, and He placed the trust in the Ahlul Bayt, in these infallible Imams who He appointed to be leaders, right? And this is why we trust them, because they have credibility, they have authenticity, transferability, right? Once we understand this, and we understand the fact that they are the most sincere of Allah's creations, then we become sincere to them. And so it was very easy for Muslim ibn Aqil that when his cousin, Imam al-Hussein salamullahi alayhi, would say to him, I want you to go to Kufa. This is, keep in mind, Imam al-Hussein had left Medina. He was in Mecca now, right? It was the month of Rajab in the year 60 AH, and Muslim ibn Aqil could have stayed with them, but the Imam salamullahi alayhi placed his trust in him, and he said to him, O Muslim, I want you to go and authenticate the letters, the 12,000 letters that were sent to me before the death of Muawiyah. And what does Muslim ibn Aqil do? He gets on his horse, he takes a couple of people with him, and they head off to Kufa. To do what? To authenticate the information that was in those letters that were sent to the Imam salamullahi alayhi. Notice what a huge responsibility that the Imam salamullahi alayhi would place his trust in Muslim ibn Aqil, and that tells us the value of Muslim ibn Aqil. But one thing we do learn is that, and we see this in everyday life, someone can be trustworthy, but because people have different agendas, right, they may not follow that person, even though they know that that person represents the truth. And that could even be the majority. And we'll talk about that in an upcoming lecture, inshallah, how that happens, why that happens. So the Imam Salamullah alayhi literally transferred his leadership to Muslim ibn Aqil by entrusting him in representation and representing him in Kufa. So he goes. When he gets to Kufa, he stays in the house of al-Mukhtar. When news comes about to the people of Kufa that Muslim ibn Aqil had arrived, all of them came to him to give allegiance to Imam Salamullahi alayhi. And Muslim ibn Aqil would write back to Imam al-Hussein Salamullahi alayhi to inform him that 18,000 people actually gave allegiance to the Imam. Those who were of high stature within society, those who had a lofty status in society in Kufa. Now, why is it that the people of Basra didn't write to the Imam? Because we said Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, who was a ruthless leader, was actually the governor of Basra. And that is why they couldn't write to the Imam, out of fear for their own lives. But Nu'man ibn Bashir didn't have that kind of relationship with Muawiyah and wasn't as ruthless as Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad and gave room for the followers of Ahlul Bayt. And news of this would get to Yazid, and Yazid would literally remove him from power, and he would appoint Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad to also be the governor of Kufa. And he would dispatch him to go to Kufa. So now Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad was not only the governor of Basra, he was also the governor of Kufa. And he would make his way to Kufa. When he entered Kufa, he was wearing white clothes and a white turban, and he had covered his face. And people actually thought that he was Imam Hussein Salamullahi alayhi. And they all flocked to him, thinking that he was an Imam al-Hussein. And what did they do? They welcomed him. And this is how Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad figured out that there were many people in Kufa who were ready to give their lives for Imam al-Hussein and to stand against Yazid. And so he went to his palace and he started to strategize on how it is that he was going to break their sense of allegiance to the Imam. or figure out how it is that he was going to break their factions and not allow them to stand against Yazid. And what ended up happening is that he found out through his spies that Muslim ibn Aqil had moved to the house of Hani ibn Urwa. And people were flocking, coming to give their allegiance to the Imam Salamullahi alayhi. Eventually what happens is Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad actually comes and visits Hani ibn Urwa in his home. And Muslim ibn Aqil was hiding for fear of being discovered by Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, knowing that Muslim was there, he would act as though he didn't know. And after meeting with Hani ibn Urwa and prodding him and trying to find out more information from him, he determined that he couldn't trust Hani ibn Urwa, that he wouldn't give up Muslim ibn Aqil. And so he ended up returning to his palace and sending his forces later on to try to break the factions of those who were standing with Muslim ibn Aqil. Muslim ibn Aqil would go out into the public square and he would announce to everyone that the Imam Salamullahi alayhi will receive word of their allegiance to him and that this is their opportunity to give their allegiance again. And what Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad would do is he would place his spies, right? And he would basically have them disseminate false propaganda, telling them that Yazid will be coming with 30,000 or 40,000 troops soon. You know, you should break up and not stand behind Muslim ibn Aqil. You're going to end up being killed. Now, keeping in mind, of course, that not everybody in Kufa at that time was actually a Kufan. There were many who were from outside Kufa that were placed in the houses of those who had been exiled from Kufa by Muawiyah before, right? You see, Muawiyah, he was very strategic. He tried very hard to be able to change the environment, the people who were within that city as much as possible, so that then he could win everybody's allegiance. He incarcerated many of the Imam's companions, many of the great generals, right? Al-Mukhtar was incarcerated, right? And others like him, people who were of high status and a high level. And one who would end up being persecuted as well was Hani ibn Urwa for his relationship with Muslim ibn Aqil. So Muslim ibn Aqil, speaking to all of these people, you know, the propaganda mongers are in there. They're putting in their 2 cents. They're causing people to separate. They're causing literally a disintegration and a dissolution of all of the people who are there. When Muslim ibn Aqil goes to pray Maghrib and Isha, the narrators say that there were numerous people behind him, that after Salat al-Maghrib, when he looked behind him, there were 30 people. After Salat al-Isha, when he looked behind him, there was absolutely none. And Muslim ibn Aqil would be hunted down from alleyway to alleyway, trying to get away from the police and from the military of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. And where would he find himself? Tired. He would sit on the door of an old woman called Talha. This woman would notice outside her door someone, a stranger, was sitting there. She would open up the door and tell him, "Oh dear man, you're a stranger. It doesn't look right for you to sit at my front porch. Please be on your way." So Muslim ibn Aqil, he looks at her and he says to her, "Dear woman, I'm a stranger in this land and I need somewhere to stay and it's late. Would you be so kind as to give me room and board for this night?" Taw'a would say to him, "It might not be proper for me to do so." Some of the narrators say that Muslim ibn Aqil would then say to her, "Do you know who I am?" She said, "No." He said, "I'm Muslim ibn Aqil." When he said that to her, she automatically trusted him. She said she was so elated and so excited that Muslim ibn Aqil was at her front door. She ushered him into the home. She said to him automatically, "This room is yours. No one comes to this room." She placed him in that room. She gave him food. She gave him water. She took good care of him. And that night, Muslim ibn Aqil would stay in her home. But he wouldn't sleep a wink. Because that night, he saw a vision. And in that vision, Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi was informing him, as some narrators say, that this is the night. And so Muslim ibn Aqil would spend his night between prayer and dua. Until Fajr would come and he would ask for taw'a, qubayl al-Fajr, just before Fajr, for water so that he can conduct his wudu. Taw'a would give him his water and she would come out. At this point, Taw'a had a son. Her son would notice her movement back and forth to that room. He would ask her, what is it that you're hiding in that room? She'd say, it's none of your business. And the reason why she said that is because she didn't trust her own son. She knew that he was evil. Now, she had never seen Muslim ibn Aqil, not even a day before that day. But because she knew who he was and who he was associated with, he had her trust automatically. And yet, her son, whom she knew ever since he was born and before, she did not trust. Because he wasn't a good person. Because he wasn't a sincere person. What ends up happening is her son would go and try to spy to see who was there. He determines Muslim ibn Aqil is there, and he goes to the court of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, and he informs him, or his troops, that Muslim ibn Aqil is in his mother's home. Pretty soon, Muslim ibn Aqil would hear the army of men coming towards the home. He would hear the galloping of the horses, and he would prepare himself after praying and making dua to leave the home of Taw'a. And he would tell Taw'a, I need to leave now. She would tell him, no, please stay. He'll say, no, I will endanger you and your house if I stay in your house. Notice the sense of responsibility. Thinking about the consequences, not just for himself, but for others and how he will affect them. And so, as he's stepping out of the door, he's faced by over 70 of the troops, all attacking him, gunning for him with their swords, throwing stones at him, throwing spears at him. They couldn't contain him because Muslim ibn Aqil was a famous warrior. He was well known for his veracity. He was well known to be ferocious when it came to the battlefield. And he was able to kill, according to what the narrators report, 41 soldiers. Now, the head of the army at that time actually called Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad and asked him for more support. And when I say called, I mean he went, he told him, I need you to send me more support. He said to him, are you kidding me? I sent over 70 men with you, and you weren't able to deal with one man? So he responds to him, he says, do you think you sent me to a grocery store owner? One of the grocery store owners of Kufa? Right? This is Muslim ibn Aqil, the great warrior of Ahl al-Bayt. So he sends more troops, and they surround Muslim ibn Aqil. And Muslim ibn Aqil, he fights valiantly until he is extremely tired and his back is to the wall. And they can't get to him, so what they do is they get on the roof of Taw'a's house and the roof of the opposing house, and they start throwing stones at him. At this point, he's extremely injured. Right? He's tired. Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, he tells them, tell him that if he stands down, that we will give him safe passage. But he would refuse. He would say that, how can I trust you? And so what ends up happening is a battle ensues between Bakr ibn Hamran, who was known to be also a ferocious warrior, but from the other side, and he ends up slicing Muslim ibn Aqil's lip. But Muslim ibn Aqil now, he has injuries all over his body. He has a severed lip, and he's tired. They end up surrounding him, taking control of him, and he says, okay, give me safe passage. They tie him up, and they take him to the court of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. Before he enters the court of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, he sees some water. He asks for them to give him a drink of water. But they wouldn't give him a drink of water. Bikr ibn Himran would end up feeling bad for him, and he would command them to give him water. And when he takes the water and he tries to drink, the water is filled with his own blood from his lips. He tries again, to no avail. A third time, to no avail. And what ends up happening is he says, this seems to be a sign that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not write for me to drink this water, for surely I must die thirsty, just as Imam Hussein will die thirsty. And so he would enter the court of Ubaydillah ibn Ziyad. They would go back and forth. Ubaydillah ibn Ziyad would speak extremely rudely to Muslim ibn Aqil. He would threaten him. And Muslim ibn Aqil didn't care for Ubaydillah ibn Ziyad and told him that there is no way that you can stop the revolution of an Imam al-Hussein salamullahi alayh, and that there is absolutely nothing that he can do to try to stop Muslim ibn Aqil, for he had already fulfilled his promise to the Imam salamullahi alayh, that trust that he had entrusted to him of delivering the message. And what ends up happening, brothers and sisters, is Ubaydillah ibn Ziyad would say to Muslim ibn Aqil, O Muslim, I will kill you in a manner that no one has been killed in the history of Islam. And what happens then is Muslim ibn Aqil would say, Ubaydillah ibn Ziyad, it gives me great pride that I will be martyred on the hands of the worst of people. And so Ubaydillah ibn Ziyad would command Bakr ibn Himran to take Muslim ibn Aqil to the roof of the palace, and he would have to execute him there. And so Muslim ibn Aqil would be tied down, and he would be told by Bakr ibn Himran to bring out his neck so that then he can strike him with his sword. But Muslim, he looks out. He looks out. They say, some report that he looked out as though he was speaking to Imam al-Hussein salamullahi alayhi, who was in Mecca or had left Mecca and was on his way to Kufa, and he had no way to warn him of what had happened to him. And he bid the Imam salamullahi alayhi farewell. He said, Assalamu ala al-Hussein. He sent his salams to the Imam salamullahi alayhi. For one last time, he asked Bakr ibn Himran if he would give him the opportunity to pray 2 rak'ahs. He would allow him. And then, brothers and sisters, he would kneel down, and his head and his neck would be ready for Bakr ibn Himran la'natullahi alayhi to strike his head until his head was severed. هل من منادي ينادي ومسلما وشهيدا. O Muslim, martyred for Imam al-Hussein. You know, brothers and sisters, they say that as Imam Hussein salamullahi alayhi was on his way to Kufa, he would be stopped in an area where he would meet someone who was coming from Kufa. And that person would be asked by the Imam, how did you leave Kufa? What was the state of Kufa? He said, I left Kufa with Muslim ibn Aqil being decapitated and thrown over the side of the palace, and his legs would be tied, him and Hani ibn Urwa, both decapitated and both being tied to a horse, and the horse would be galloping through the streets of Kufa, dragging them behind. And Imam al-Hussein salamullahi alayhi, at this point, the only thing that the narrators say is that he was thinking of one person at that point. And he would make his way through the factions of the Ahl al-Bayt. He would make it through one child after the other. He would put his hands moving through the children one after the other, until, brothers and sisters, he would see He would see Hamida. Hamida was the daughter of Muslim ibn Aqil. Imam Hussein, salamullahi alayhi, he would tell her to come near. It's as though we can hear him say, Hamida. Ilayya, Hamida. Come to me, Hamida. And once she came to him, he would place his hand on her head. They say that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said that how we should treat an orphan when we see them is that we should place our hand on their forehead. And Imam Hussein, salamullahi alayhi, would place his hand on the little girl's forehead. She would say to him, "Oh Amma, your uncle, why is it that you place your hand on my forehead, just like they do with the orphans?" Imam Hussein, salamullahi alayhi, the narrators say, he would say to her, "Dear daughter Hamid, from this day forward, I am your father, and these are your sisters, and my wife is your mother." Hamid, at that point, the narrators say, would look at Imam al-Hussein and say, "But it is so wonderful for one to have a father. هل من منادي ينادي?" Will someone call out and say, ومسلما وشهيدا ومظلوما السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين. These tears will intercede for us on the day of judgment, brothers and sisters. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين وعلى الذين بذلوا مهجهم دون الحسين. O Muslim, no longer will you be able to place your daughter on your lap. No longer will you be able to see her smile. No longer will she feel the kindness and love and caress of her father. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. سيعلم الذين ظلموا على بيت رسول الله إلى أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. Oh Allah, we ask you and we beseech you to make us of those who can be trusted by our Imam. Oh Allah, make us trustworthy, Ya Rabbal Alameen. Allow us to have those essential characteristics that allow us to be trusted by our Imam. For surely we cannot be his servants without having that trust. And that means that, oh Allah, we ask you to give us our sincerity, Ya Rabbal Alameen, so that it is dedicated to you, and we, in everything that we do, are dedicated to you alone and to no one else. Allah, we ask you and we beseech you that you make us like Muslims. Oh Allah, we ask you and we beseech you that you repay the debts of all those who are in debt, that you give health to all of our sick, that you bestow your mercy on our dearly departed, and that you release all those who are imprisoned wrongfully, Ya Rabb. Oh Allah, we ask you and we beseech you that you return those who are estranged from their lands to their homelands. Oh Allah, we ask you and we beseech you that you accept what little we offer, that you support the founders of every single organization that commemorates the event of Karbala and of Ahl al-Bayt. Oh Allah, we ask you and we beseech you that you support the volunteers that make such programs a reality for people, because surely they are the ones that have been entrusted with propagating the truth. Allah, we ask you to support them, those in the past, those today, and those in the future. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين والفاتحة على أرواح المرحومين ولتعجيل فرج ولي الله على الأرضين مسبوقة مشفوعة بالصلاة على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على